Hello again. Welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and here in the UK, we are in the midst of election fever. It's a fever because you don't want it, it gives you a headache, and you just hope it's going to be over soon. But to win us over, and to stop us talking about Brexit, politicians are promising the world tax cuts, more police officers, free childcare, more money for schools, new hospitals, and that's just the Tories. Meanwhile, Labour is pledging free high-speed broadband for everyone. So today, we're going to look at the idea, not just of broadband, but also the idea that governments can spend more money if they want to. And the fact that they can, does that mean they should? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. Now, as a side note, before we do start to talk about broadband, one of Sajid Javid's proposals is to abolish inheritance tax, which is a complete turnaround for the Tories from the last election, because then they were proposing that old people in nursing homes should use some of their money that will be inheritance. They should sell their family property to cover their care in the nursing home. So in other words, digging into their children's inheritance. And that didn't go down well. So now abolishing inheritance tax, which applies to currently any money you inherit over £325,000. That sounds like getting rid of a tax on the rich, doesn't it? Even if it's applied after they've died. That's passing wealth from one generation to another without any tax whatsoever. Passing money from the rich onto the youngsters who are going to continue to be rich, passing it on from one generation to the next, something which Britain is terribly good at. But enough on that. What about broadband? Boris Johnson is calling it communist broadband, the pledge by the UK Labour Party that if they are elected, they're going to deliver free high-speed broadband to everyone by 2030. But it's just one of many election pledges from both sides of the political spectrum, all offering us more than we have now without paying any more taxes. In fact, Boris is saying he wants to spend more and cut taxes. So, Steve, I mean, you could argue that this is all fine, couldn't you? Because with modern monetary theory, governments can spend more, go into a budget deficit, pay for it with money created by the central bank, and you could keep on doing that, theoretically, till inflation becomes a problem. But as this is demonstrating, the fact that you can do it, I mean, where is the discipline in all of this? You could just keep on coming up with crazy ideas till the cows come home.
Well, that's the one thing, of course, neither side of this election campaign is putting its flag up on MMT.
No.
So we have this...
They're all saying it's going to be paid for somehow, absolutely.
They all think, both sides are saying you've got a tax to cover it, and they're both giving their taxation plan. So in a political sense, MMT is not part of this particular election. The issue of discipline is important. And it applies on twofold, not just on how the government spends the money. I mean, one obvious example of MMT is the American military occupation around the planet. Mm. Okay, that's all paid for with American dollars. They can generate an unlimited amount of it. The scale of the American defence budget is something of the order of I'm not sure. It'd be one fun one to look up for you on another future topic, but it's at least 10% of government spending, I think, and a substantial part of the economy. And nobody ever asks how do we get money for that next nuclear missile or that next cruise missile. It's just appropriated without argument, and that seems to be a trend globally.
But they would still be trying to pay for that out of taxes, wouldn't they, in the United States? I mean, they are...
Well, they claim it. Again, this is what... Let's look... I hate to bring it back to this, mate. I really do. But let's look at the empirical data. And
you want to talk facts?
I want to talk facts, yeah.
That is what is...
I'll be careful. I'll even get my facts from the White House. If you go search for White House data on the web, you will find an excellent store of a range of extra sources of data, in particular the United States surplus. Since last time I checked, it was 1900, but it's called Historical Tables at the White House. And if you go there, you'll see summary of receipts, outputs, and surplus and deficits, 1789 to 2024. And then as percentage of GDP, 1930 to 2024. 2024 obviously being the end of the next budget period. I've taken data from the first table and divided by GDP to get a series from 1900 till now, which is 120 years long. And I think maybe, just maybe, an economist might agree that 120 years is close to the long run. Mm. Okay.
You can take a trend from that, I think. Yeah.
The average surplus for the last 120 years has been minus 2.4% of GDP. If you take out funding the world wars, which of course were an enormous, the deficit hit as much as 30% of GDP in 1 year, it's about 2.2%. So in other words, for 120 years, the American government
has been getting further and further into debt in that case.
No, the government's been financing itself quite effectively. This has been the American century.
Right.
And if you believe all the people that say you've got to have hard money,
right.
the past century, the American century, got to have hard money, everything will all be ruined if we have fiat currencies that don't maintain their value, et cetera, et cetera. During that period, America became the world's superpower, and at the end of it is still the world's superpower. And I think it's going to lose that status sometime in the 22nd century. Actually, sorry.
You think we'll have to wait that long? Yeah.
No, this century.
Sometime in the next couple of decades, I would have thought.
Yeah, I reckon it's going to lose its status, but it hasn't for the whole period that it was running a deficit on average of 2.2% of GDP, excluding wars.
Right.
So, in other words, it's quite sustainable to run that deficit. People say it can't be do it. We'll all be ruined. Yeah,
but how are they managing those numbers? Because if that's happening every year and it's been going for 120 years, then surely the accumulated deficit for how they're accounting for their budget would be absolutely enormous. Now, I know it is enormous. Is that what's been happening? It's just been creeping up year by year.
It's running, the accumulated debt now is running at about 100% of GDP. It was down about 60% before the financial crisis. I just realized I can actually use this new data to get figures for the American surplus as a percentage of GDP right back to 1789. So I'll do that after we finish chatting. But it can run this indefinitely, and that's the point of MMT. So long as your currency is accepted in its political realm, you can run a deficit of any scale. It's a question of what that scale does to your economy. Yeah. Now, one of my rules of thumb is that the amount of money the government should create every year should be roughly equal to nominal GDP growth divided by the velocity of circulation of money. And lo and behold, that comes out at about 2.5% of GDP.
Right. So,
because
so there is some fiscal control. I mean,
you've had this. Every government, for the last 120 years, has sworn they're going to get the country back to surplus. Now, the two governments that managed to do that were the governments in America in the 1920s, and they were saving for a rainy day. The rainy day, of course, they knew they were going to have, called the Great Depression. They ran a surplus of 1% of GDP every year for pretty much the whole of the 1920s. That was a major causal factor behind the Great Depression because, and this is the point of MMT, when you run a surplus, somebody else is running an identical deficit. Yeah. If the government's getting a surplus of 1% of GDP, the rest of the society is getting minus 1% of GDP.
And do you know what? Even if you were to, and this is, I know this annoys you as much as it annoys me, the idea that, people talk about the economy being run like a household budget. If you were to run that analogy, people generally spend more than they actually bring in as well. People,
credit is part of overall expenditure. The question is, don't let credit get out of hand, and what we're talking about is don't let government spending get out of hand. Yeah. But we should get back to the point, Matt. In that sense, I think, this is a discussion for another point. The real thing is this broadband issue because
well, because I wanted to just lay the foundation behind that because is it because then you get to the question: if you've got a big project like this, how can you say, and you're going to allocate government money, however it's funded, how can you say whether this is a good idea or not?
Well, I think there are some technologies which are pretty bloody obviously a good idea. And for example, I think putting bitumen on the ground when you get building cars as a transportation system makes eminent sense. Yeah. I highly recommend this. One of my favorite, one of the very few movie series that never disappointed at any stage was Back to the Future. I bought all three and watched them again just recently. And when Marty in episode 3 blasts off in the DeLorean to head back to the 1880s, I think it is, to rescue his future, he comes off the. I think he's actually driving inside a drive-in cinema. Remember those? Yeah. And he's accelerating towards the screen and gets on the other side. He's on rough country. So the state laid out those roads, and actually a large part of it occurred during the 1930s with the building of the interstate highway system in the United States. So if you know people are needing a technology then there's sometimes you should provide it as soon as possible. And the question is it better done by private interests or is it better done by the state? And broadband, I think, is just like the road system, is an eminently useful example of that because...
Yeah, do you know what? I don't actually agree with Steve Keen on this point, but if you want to find out why, you have to listen to the full podcast. To do that, you need to subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com or become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen and become a supporter, pledging $10 or more support to Steve's work. And you get access to this and all the other podcasts in this series, including my view that the horse has already bolted. The private sector has already gone so far in the provision of broadband, it would be nuts to therefore throw it back to the public sector. You might disagree, but if you want to take a view, listen to the whole podcast, and we'll see you back here again very soon. Thanks for listening.